Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Presbyterian Church at Tenafly. It's great to have you all here on a Sunday afternoon in high summer. This was a bit of a gamble holding an event at this time of year, but we felt we really couldn't miss the chance to snap up Nora and Elaine. And really, this was the only chance to do it. Partly it's because Nora's book was launched quite recently, and also Elaine was about to become unavailable to us. So to have this particular conversation, it really had to be today. And so we're delighted that so many have come to be part of this. A couple of things to say. If you would like to join our mailing list for special events, cultural, musical, all sorts of things, and if you haven't seen somebody in the foyer already, you could maybe do that on the way out. So if you'd like to give us your email address, we'll keep you in touch. There aren't any books for sale today, but if you have brought along your own copy, I know Nora would be very glad to sign it afterwards. I'm sure you'll rush out and get your own copy if you don't have one already. But both Nora and Elaine would love it if you would come to the front and chat with them afterwards, even if you don't have a book to sign. But if you do have a book, please bring it forward. We'll also give you the chance to ask questions. So once they finish the conversation, they'll manage that, and we'll come round with a roving mic. And if you'd wait till the mic comes to you so that we can all hear your question, that would be great. There will also be the opportunity to make a contribution to our Arts Outreach Fund if you'd like to on the way out. No pressure, it's a free event, but if you feel moved to do that, there are some plates in the foyer. Now, in introducing our guests today, I'd like to share a couple of quotations from two great people. And the first one, I think, is probably still on the inside cover of the book. It was certainly in the advance copy.
I don't know where you're going with this.
I hope it isn't out, but from Desmond Tutu.
Yeah, it's there.
Is it still there? That's
yes,
great.
Yes.
And Desmond Tutu famously said, "If you are neutral in the face of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." And a second one, which is not in the book, but I thought was appropriate, from the philosopher John Stuart Mill. This was from an inaugural lecture at the University of St Andrews, Scotland, where I come from, in 1867. An old quotation, but I think very much relevant today. And he said, "Let not anyone pacify his conscience by the delusion that he can do no harm if he takes no part and forms no opinion. Bad men," sorry about the language, "bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing. He is not a good man who, without a protest, allows wrong to be committed in his name and with the means which he helps to supply, because he will not trouble himself to use his mind on the subject." Those are two serious quotes. To introduce, if I may say, two serious women. They're great fun as well, but I mean serious in the best possible way. I mean that in their work, they demonstrate what Tutu and Mill have urged us to do. Many here know Nora already, know of her work as a reporter, her courageous work as a reporter, and the way that she tackles really major issues around justice for those who find themselves marginalized. And the Reverend Dr. Elaine Ellis Thomas, as an Episcopal priest, is in similar spaces from a different angle. She was described to me by one of her colleagues in the diocese as a heavy hitter of the Episcopal Church. Quite apt for somebody who's a mad baseball fan. And it is true, I think. I think you'll agree with me by the end of this session today. Both Nora and Elaine are incredibly courageous, compassionate, and articulate women, and it's our honor to have you both here to be in this conversation today about 24 hours in Charlottesville. So please, will you join me in welcoming Nora Nues and Elaine Ellis Thomas.
Thanks for that, great. I hope we could live up to this,
That
Nora.
was intense.
That was intense. It's so good to be here with Nora. In preparation for today, we had a phone conversation earlier this week, and we just started chatting about all the places and people and events that are mutually familiar to us. And so We are probably going to make this more of a conversation than an interview, but I am going to start off asking her a few questions because we know a lot about Charlottesville and what happened there, not just in 2017, but in the years leading up to it, and realized that might not be familiar territory for many of you. So I was going to start by asking Nora how she came to be in Charlottesville, her impressions of this, what most of us would understand to be this sleepy university town in central Virginia in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and just to get a little context for what the rest of the conversation is going to be. So it's all yours.
I mean, I think that surface idea is exactly what Charlottesville meant to me in the beginning and what drew me to Charlottesville. It is one of the most beautiful places I have ever been. It is a kind of sleepy bucolic college town on the surface. It's wine country. There's a lot of wineries. There's a lot of, as someone told me in my book, a lot of concentration on someone else's good time. So the amount of time that you're spending in hospitality spaces, hospitality-oriented spaces, which then kind of belies this other side of town, which is people making that good time happen. And that is not just something that is currently happening, but something that has happened since it was the home of Thomas Jefferson and the home of Monticello. And the University of Virginia is the school in Charlottesville. UVA and Charlottesville both have a very strong connection to Jefferson. It was his home. The university was his brainchild. We used to say he built the university. Of course he didn't. Enslaved laborers that he owned built the university. And so those descendants, many live in town still. And there is a severe inequality between the, frankly, white community of Charlottesville, university community of Charlottesville, and the people that actually help make the city run. And so this has been the history of Charlottesville for a very long time, but it's easy to ignore it when you're only traveling in certain spaces. And as a university student, it's often easy to ignore it because you're only traveling in certain spaces. And so as a student, I didn't fully understand this. And I definitely, by the end of my time at UVA, was starting to come to an appreciation as I was looking for housing, actually. I decided I was going to live in Charlottesville after college. And then started realizing at the same time that I became a local news reporter in town and was going to parts of town I had never been before, with rich history and generations of community, how much of a limited scope I had as a student.
Yeah, the University of Virginia, it is a university town with a little bit of civic town attached to it. And so housing for anyone who's not affiliated with the university is, shall we say, difficult to find and very costly if you can find it. So in the lead up to the year 2017, I think most people, when they think of what happened over that summer, think that it's about the removal of the Confederate monuments. And there was a Blue Ribbon Commission appointed to study the monuments and presented a proposal early in 2017 to City Council saying they need to come down. So that, but you make very clear, and it's true, it's not about the monuments. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit more about that environment around the monuments and that kind of it being a flashpoint for this right-wing attention.
Yeah, and a lot of that the focus on the Confederate monuments in Charlottesville was happening in a time when we were talking about Confederate monuments in South Carolina, in New Orleans. There were a couple of cities that were really grappling with this. And one thing to understand about the statue itself was that it was not erected. So there's a Lee statue, and then there's a couple of other Confederate general statues right in the downtown of Charlottesville. Proud warriors having won is essentially what they look like. They lost, but we pretend they won in Charlottesville. And they were not erected in the wake of the Civil War. They were erected in the 1920s by KKK-funded organizations that wanted to put their stamp on this town and who the town belonged to. This was already revisionist history when they were put up. And so the statues were a part of this focus on town, but there were a lot of other factors at play. And there was, this is an oversimplification, but a group of white nationalists, which is a group of white supremacist, far-right individuals who have used the term white nationalist to legitimize themselves or try to. And so they would say that they're not white supremacists, they just want equal rights, and that they have a whole host of kind of positions that I won't get into. But they're not great positions. They are founded by 2 University of Virginia graduates. And Richard Spencer, who is the head of the white nationalist movement overall, and then Jason Kessler, who is the head of the white nationalist movement essentially in Charlottesville. Both were UVA graduates, and that was kind of their connection. And then the statue debate came up, and then the KKK started coming to town kind of because of the statues, but then it turned into this kind of like very intense situation where one thing would go, it felt like one thing, like, you know, you drop one match and the whole thing would go up. And that's basically what happened that summer.
So as I look back on those days, I was an associate rector at St. Paul's Memorial Church at the University of Virginia, which is directly across from Jefferson's Rotunda. It's very much connected with the university. And my first understanding of what might happen was Mother's Day weekend, when
Yes.
it was the first torchlight rally around the Lee statue. And that became kind of the wake-up call for a lot of people in the community that these decisions about the monuments had attracted a lot of this white nationalist attention. Mm-hmm. So now we're in May with Mother's Day, and it's like one thing after another, but I want you to tell the story. How was it the weekend that your book is written about, 24 Hours in Charlottesville? What were you doing then? Where were you? What were you involved with? What did you see? Kind of what was your experience like before we talk about everyone else's?
Yeah. So I had been living this debate for the last couple of months because I was the local crime and local politics reporter and then a fill-in news anchor. So if someone was out, I would end up anchoring the evening news after reporting all day. And so I was out in these meetings. I went to every single Blue Ribbon Commission meeting. I was at every city council meeting. And then we were starting to cover these, like, at the time, what felt like kind of these weird demonstrations, like these guys who showed up with tiki torches the first time in May. This is not what you're thinking of, the famous images of people with tiki torches at UVA. That was months later. This had started already. And so I think this common perception also of, like, Charlottesville, it came out of nowhere. We had no idea. It's like, yeah, for the national consciousness, but we in town knew this was coming. Absolutely knew that this was coming. Which is part of what was so frustrating when the city government didn't take it seriously. The city refused to declare a state of emergency. They refused to send out any kind of emergency alerts or warnings, whereas the week before they had sent out an alert about a baby bear that was, like, roaming around. So that was deemed dangerous enough to send a reverse 911 call out, but not this. The farmer's market 2-3 blocks away was still going that morning. There's this giant farmer's market that Charlottesville is really known for. And this had been on the schedule. This had been on the calendar. This was a permitted event, which is a whole other side note that we can talk about the permit and everything there. So I was covering all of this, and then I got my dream job offer at CNN in New York. My family is from Tenafly. I grew up here. I wanted to be back closer to them. And I got this dream job offer. So I took it. I had 2 weeks to move. I moved. And a few weeks after that was like mid-July, I had to get the rest of my boxes out of my apartment. And my dad offered to drive down with me because it was 8-9 hours down. And the weekend that worked for this was the weekend of the riot. And I remember texting my friend from the car as we were going down saying, like, this was probably dumb, right? To try to come today. But she lived north of town. I figured it would be contained, and I mean, by very early morning, it became very clear that this was going to erupt into a potentially fatal situation, which it did. So I got to town that evening, and then the next day was downtown. There were a lot of demonstrations, kind of like sporadic demonstrations the next day. and then was there for a week field producing for CNN, which then was my brand new job. So I was in the right place for them, but a traumatizing summer and traumatizing experience.
It's such a random thing that was the weekend you chose to come back. So you were there for Friday for the Tiki Torch March and all of that, or you were not?
No,
in town
I wasn't there
for
in
that?
town
Okay,
yet.
all right.
Yeah.
So on Friday, August 11th in 2017, we had been, I'd spent that summer organizing with other clergy, religious leaders, community activists. There were several pockets of organization happening. And on that Friday in the evening at my church, St. Paul's, we were going to have a mass prayer rally. It was to be reminiscent of in the civil rights days when they bring in the big speaker, Martin Luther King or somebody to energize the troops before people peacefully marched in the streets the next day. And early that morning, we had at St. Paul's had planned to have off-duty police officers offering security because we knew that the march, the rally the next day, so-called Unite the Right rally, was going to be volatile. And so we thought, well, we'll just get some off-duty police officers. And we got a call at about 9 in the morning saying you can't have them. And we're like, why can't we? And they said, we need them all. So with that having been said, and our having let the police, both the University Police, the Charlottesville Police, the Albemarle County Sheriffs, know that something was up and was going to happen, we assumed that there would be a response on Friday night.
And to put a finer point on this too, this isn't just like a church had a prayer service. This is 700 people breaking fire code,
Yes, we did.
packed into this church, spill out outside. Charlottesville is a kind of a group think community, and like not always a great way, but like if there's one place to be on a given night, the entire city will show up. This was like the only place to be that night. The Washington Post was there, CBS was there, Katie Couric was in the crowd, Cornel West gave a speech. There was nothing else happening. This was the nexus of the entire community for that night.
Correct. And so about 9 o'clock that evening, I was on a lot of chat groups that were encrypted so that nobody could tap into them, and we were getting some rumors that there was something happening across the street at the Thomas Jefferson statue, which sits in front of the rotunda. And you know the campus, the grounds more, well, I know them, but I'm going to let you describe them, kind of what happened, because I know that they started at Nameless Field and then did their march.
Yeah, the short version is that the white nationalists decided that they wanted to have a march the night before the big rally to kind of get people going, which is pretty standard practice for how these white nationalist groups work. So the activists knew this was going to happen. The activist kind of newspapers, websites publicized this at about 7 p.m. The organizer, Jason Kessler, called the university police department and said, hey, we're going to do this march tonight. And they said, great, stay on the sidewalk. And essentially, and they ended up gathering hundreds of men with torches. And these are the images that you probably have seen. If you've ever seen any image of Charlottesville with a torch, it's almost definitely from this night. And they paraded kind of in a circle almost around grounds, which is what they call campus, and then up by the rotunda, which is the main building on campus, and then around the statue of Thomas Jefferson. And across the street from this is the church. And there was a group of students, 12 maybe, who had heard the chatter that this was coming, and they decided to go and counter-protest. The kind of driving ethos in confronting white nationalism then and especially now is to not let it happen, not give it oxygen, not let it kind of fester, to vocally stand up and say to white nationalism, this is not okay, we do not agree with this, you are not welcome here, do not spread your hate and your fascism here. So what would happen in all that summer would be, as soon as Jason Kessler was spotted eating downtown, people would go and tell the manager, like, that's a known fascist neo-Nazi, like, kick him out, and they would. And so these students showed up thinking that's what was going to happen, but everyone was either in the church or planning for the next morning. And so they were surrounded by a group of 200 to 300 neo-Nazis who essentially beat them, tried unsuccessfully to kill them. And there's some graphic descriptions in the book of what exactly happens there. But finally, 2 professors come and try to help. The dean of students, who's this like genteel Southern older man with white hair, got rushed in to save students. He was, I don't know, in his 60s at that point, at least. Sorry, mom and dad. I don't know.
He was a young 60.
It was a sprightly young 6-year-old with a lot of energy and life left.
Alan Gross,
ran in, and fought these neo-Nazis who were like 20. That's the point of his age, and cut himself and got extremely hurt and had a torch thrown at him and cut open his arm and it was just. I mean, he would wear bow ties every day. Like that's the kind of guy we're talking about. And so that night, knowing it was going to happen, the police were told that it was going to happen. And then there was this thought with people in the church. It was a church that looked a lot like this one. Imagine it's completely packed. You have some camera crews, but you're here like singing against white supremacy, and something starts happening. And you in the pews don't know what it is. But you can tell that something's happening. There's people running around on the stage. There's singing happening, but the pastors look scared. They're scurrying around. Because there were no off-duty cops available, activist security was there. So a lot of young men from the community were the ones providing security. The way it's been described to me over and over again in the crowd, it's just like you knew something was going on and something was like bad happening, but you didn't really know what. And people started getting on their phones and started seeing the pictures and the videos of this violent march with torches across the street. Now, at the same time, what the people in those pews didn't know is that white nationalists had called in bomb threats and shooting threats to the church. And so Charlottesville Police Department officials, after denying out-of-uniform officers, did end up responding to search the grounds for shooters, but they had never searched people in the pews. There was a white nationalist in the audience, and he was not armed. I mean, or we don't know, he didn't shoot anyone. He probably was armed, to be honest. But they ended up locking down the church, and you can probably speak to this from your perspective, but they ended up saying, there's a situation outside, we don't want to cause panic, we're going to keep singing, but no one goes in, no one goes out, we're locking down the church. And there is an older black activist in Charlottesville who said, it felt like we were like in Birmingham, like we felt like we were about to be firebombed. We felt like this was going to be it for us.
It was terrifying, but also as one of the clergy, trying to maintain calm and to keep people to keep the anxiety from going up. We just continued to sing. We had some really talented activist musicians who sang freedom songs and all of that, while the rest of us were trying diligently to find out just what the level of danger was. I have seen a lot of reports in the aftermath saying, the torches surrounded the church, they blocked the church. They never came near the church, but the rotunda is literally within spitting distance of it. But we couldn't let people out into the streets because we were concerned for their safety. When we finally could, we sent them out at least in pairs, nobody left alone. We had people accompanied. By the time we were leaving the church, the march had dissipated. And some of the people who were injured or were trying to assist the injured had come to the church to get water to wash tear gas out of people's eyes. The number of people injured, and most of those injuries and most of the charges that came later against some of these white nationalists came from their actions that night as opposed to the next day because of the violence there. But those were the ones that were documented, filmed, provable, and so but we were able to let everyone leave, and I don't know if we talked about this, but in the years since then, we're coming up on the 6th anniversary. It has been one of my great regrets that we didn't leave a few people to watch over the congregation and have the massive number of clergy who were there just walk across the street to take care of these people. But I know there are a lot of us who have many second guesses about what we might have done that weekend. But in the moment, I felt our job was to make sure that the 700 people in a 450 capacity church were safe. And so that's what we did. Yeah. And I think one of the lessons learned from that night, as all of this is going on and Dean Groves is going in to help and some other staff from the university were trying to help, none of the police did anything, not the university police, not the city police. And it's a tenuous relationship between the city of Charlottesville police and the university police. The lines of responsibility are sometimes a little bit too tightly drawn, but so the Charlottesville police said, well, that should have been the university police.
They both, after the fact, said it should have been the other guys.
Yeah, right.
But they also weren't there, so no one was helping. Right. I mean, there were a couple of police officers earlier in the march, but by the time there was this violent melee, there were no police. I mean, that from every possible angle, from all the video footage, from multiple eyewitnesses, and from the after action report for the Virginia State Police, there were no officers there because they all were staffed on 12-hour days for the next day, which maybe would make sense if the white nationalists called the police to tell them that they were going to have a rally. And in some of my conversations that are in the book with people after the fact say, why did you believe them? There was a lot of, well, I don't know, they were just protesters. And the one that I got was, well, the University of Virginia has an honor code. And the two organizers were UVA alums. And so we figured that they were abiding by the honor code and weren't lying about their intentions to be violent.
Right. So I think some of the aftermath, some of the reporting that was done and some of the analysis that was done, had there been more of a resistance, an official resistance to Friday night, perhaps Saturday would not have devolved the way it did. So Saturday comes, that's August 12th, 2017, and I want, just before we get into the details, I want to talk about who you got your stories from for the book and how you went about doing that. Because what I find unique about her approach is she taught with people who were either activists or victims or who had participated and still suffer from harm. And so I'll let you talk a little bit more about that.
The wounds, both physical and mental, are still very, very present in this community. Especially for, a lot of folks have moved out of town, and then the people that are left in town are the folks that can't afford to move out of town, but still have to see the reminders of this everywhere they go. And the knowledge that their government and their police force did nothing to protect them. And that if anything ever else happened, they can't rely on their leaders to protect them, which is really emotionally devastating. For so many communities, they've known that for a long time. But that is a new thought for a lot of people in Charlottesville. And so the book is told in the stories of activists, survivors, journalists, some politicians, some kind of policymakers, and folks who were there on the ground. So the whole book, there's very little of my words in the book. And where it is my writing, it's just kind of stringing things together, but it's really told like in snippet by snippet of other people's voices. And the one group that I did not interview was white nationalists. And this is something that is a big topic of conversation within journalism and within anti-racist work. The basic premise is that you don't platform neo-Nazis. You don't platform white supremacists. You don't give them the satisfaction of being interviewed, the ability to take their words and then use it as propaganda, to brag that they were featured in a new book about Charlottesville. And that their hate is so well documented. There have been lawsuits. There's a lot of court documents in the book that I've quoted from. There's a lot of video. Their side of the story, so to speak, is told in the book, but through words that already existed. I didn't do any fresh interviews with them, which is a tenet of kind of values-based journalism.
So when we talk about what happened on August 12th, one of the things that struck me in a book launch that you did in Charlottesville, and you gave it away as you said at the beginning, which is we knew what was going to happen. And you talked about the emergency services director at University of Virginia Hospital, and I just wonder if you'd set that up as we talk a little bit about the events of the day.
Yeah, I think this is what's so hard to understand now and kind of grapple with. They knew what was going to happen to the extent that activists put together a dossier with quotes from DMs and direct messages and emails and texts and from the white nationalists describing what they were going to do and where they were going to do it. And the emergency services director of the UVA hospital had Army experience. He had been in the Army for decades and was working at the Pentagon on 9/11 and was part of the Pentagon 9/11 response. His kind of cushy retirement job that ended up not being so great was emergency services director at UVA Medical Center. He, months before this happened, started looking at open source intelligence and very, very quickly picked up on the fact that this was going to be a mass casualty incident. Those were the words he was using. And he briefed the police on this, he briefed the university on this. And then at the same time, this group of activists that had this dossier went to city council and presented the dossier, printed out copies for everyone, and presented it. And the activist reporting network was extremely strong. There were plenty of articles that at the time were dismissed as like, oh, this is like a liberal blog. But they were completely right and actually doing the reporting on what these people were planning. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons from the book, is to listen to people. And it was the citizens, it was the civilians who actually knew what was going to happen and were taking this seriously more than any of the elected officials and more than the police, certainly.
And as an addendum to that, I would say that in the aftermath, it is the civilian online sleuths who have located a lot of the participants that day who have ultimately been identified and arrested. So it continued even after the fact. So my day that day started at 5 in the morning. We went to the Baptist church for another prayer meeting at 6 o'clock. And after that, two processions started. One went directly to the park down Market Street, and one went to the Jefferson School to another park, and then we were at the Methodist Church, which is on the northern end of the park where the Lee statue is. So my day, that's how my day unfolded. Tell us a little bit, I mean, it's well known, I think, the events of that day, but just kind of to recap, the gathering, the state of emergency, the people going into the community, which was totally not good.
Yes, so the event was supposed to start at noon, and it was slated as the Unite the Right rally. There were going to be some speakers, and it was permitted. It was granted a permit for freedom of speech reasons. They tried to renege on it. There's a whole court case we can get into that. It's kind of in the weeds. It's in the book. But they were allowed to come at noon, have speakers with amplified sound, and their number of attendees. Instead, before 8 a.m., just around 8 a.m., groups of dozens and then hundreds of white nationalists, neo-Nazis, people wearing Hitler t-shirts, head-to-toe military fatigued men who were not actually in the military, people with AK-47s wearing civilian clothing, a large group of like Viking-dressed people who that may sound familiar from January 6th. That's like a thing in this community. So there were some Vikings there as well, also with AK-47s. And very, very quickly, it became very clear that this was going to become violent. And there were these different factions, basically, of the white supremacist movement that had all gathered here in Charlottesville, which is part of what made it so bad. And the counter-protesters, which is this group of people in Charlottesville who wanted to go out and say, like, this is not okay, we don't stand for this, were in the streets. And very quickly, by like 9 a.m., it devolved into an all-out street brawl. People were not just like physically, like punching beat up, but there were nails attached to pieces of plywood that they were using to hit people. They were throwing open bottles full of urine at people, and hammers and axes and
Clubs.
Clubs.
Sticks.
There were a lot of clubs, actually.
A lot of clubs, yeah.
And they were fighting against primarily, almost entirely unarmed counter-protesters, many of whom were clergy, with as one guy, as our mutual friend Seth said, in clergy drag, like fully head to toe in the clergy drag, being like beat up by white supremacists. And the police did nothing. The police did nothing to the extent that there's on body camera footage, cops saying to one another, why aren't we doing anything? Like, this is great, they're like gonna kill someone. And there's a lot of conversation about why that happened. The short version, the charitable version, is that they were worried that if the police pulled out a gun or tried to stop any of this, it would turn into an all-out street battle, and the continuum of force would continue until there was like open fire in the streets of Charlottesville. Other people argue the cops could have done literally anything to try to help protect civilians. And they chose not to. They stood behind barricades for hours while people were coming up to them, even asking for help, like bleeding people coming up to them asking for help, did not budge. And city police, state troopers, and again, like that's not even a political statement that I'm trying to make. Like factually, the police were behind the barricades and did not intervene. The Virginia State Police After Action Report has said that. That is what happened. No one denies that that's what happened. So eventually they declare a state of emergency and say they're going to clear the park. And so finally a line of riot police come and clear the park. But the park is in the middle of downtown Charlottesville. It's a block by a block, and already the fighting was all in like the streets around. So they decided they're going to clear the park, and all that did was then push all of these brawling, violent, amped up neo-Nazis out into the neighborhoods of Charlottesville. And all the police stayed there in the park, which they had cleared. Yeah. So you don't have an empty park with 500 police officers or something like that. Don't quote me on that number, but you have hundreds of police officers in this empty park, and then people terrorizing the entire community of Charlottesville.
And made a beeline for the Black communities in particular.
In the public housing complex. Yeah. And so this is another part of the story that is misremembered in like public memory. A lot of the story is the white nationalists were protesting, the folks who were counter-protesting were out there with their signs too, and a white nationalist got mad and drove his car into the crowd and killed someone. That's not really how it happened. All the Nazis have been driven out of the park. They disperse all throughout town. Some of them start leaving. It's basically beginning to quiet down briefly. There's a lunch break for a lot of the counter-protesters. There's a park, this park that you had mentioned, that has peanut butter sandwiches and burritos, vegan burritos was the lunch menu that day. And so they're like kind of hanging out fine. They say, a lot of people say that was like the first time that they were able to like relax for a second that day. It also was like 95 degrees, so they all were so hot and sweaty.
This was August 12th in Virginia.
Yeah, it was like swampy. Mm-hmm. And so they get this call that some of the white nationalists who are still around are down at the public housing complex. That's primarily people of color. And they head over. And when they get most of the way there, they get word that some of the men in that community are standing up for themselves against the neo-Nazis, and they don't want them to come any closer because they're worried it'll inflame tensions. They basically say, we've got this, thank you so much, but like you're good to go do something else. Activists say, great. So they turn around, and at this point, it's the first time that they're like, wow, we're okay. Like we've got this. We ended the rally before it ever started. The rally was never allowed to happen. It was horrible, but like we did what we said we were going to do. So they start celebrating, and they start singing, and they're marching back up to the park where most of them left their backpacks and where the snacks are, and they get into this kind of narrow historic street in Charlottesville to go up the hill to go back to this park, and that's when a neo-Nazi driving a Dodge Charger barreled full speed into the crowd. And Heather Heyer was killed, they think almost immediately. And they think dozens more would have been killed if not for a car that had taken a wrong turn. 2 young black women in Charlottesville who were part of the lower income community who had taken a wrong turn and got caught in this group of people. And they're, at the time, thinking like, oh God, we're gonna like run over someone by accident. Like they're trying to be like so careful and driving safely. One of them had like nursing training, and so was trying to like keep an eye out, but everyone seemed good and happy. And so when the Charger hit the crowd, it actually hit that car. Heather was in between them, that's why Heather was killed. But that car stopped them. And so those 2 women are Tay and Micah Washington. Incredible, incredible women. Are still unable to work, still have severe like lower limb injuries. One of the sisters tried to get out of, the one that had nursing experience, tried to get out of the car to help people and then realized she couldn't stand or walk. They are 2 people, and we can come back to this at some point, but they are the 2 people that, 2 of the people that I really hold in mind as people whose entire lives were changed in that instance. And they are still in Charlottesville. Their mom's house, their mom's apartment just had a horrible apartment fire 2 weeks ago and lost everything. Like they're just trying to like get themselves back on track. And they just happen to be in that car. And they still say to this day that they think God put them there to save the lives of all these other people.
I have heard many people will still claim that it was an accident, that it wasn't intentional. There had been actual chatter on some of these chat groups about car attacks, so it was pretty clear that this was not just an accident. And it was after this, at one of the early court hearings, that they showed the video, the security video from a restaurant called the Red Pump. It's right at the corner of the downtown mall, which is a pedestrian mall, and this street, 4th Street. And it shows James Fields, who was the driver of that car, realizing he couldn't get through once he was at the downtown mall. He could see the car and the crowds down below. And you see him backing up as if he was going to try to go a different way. It's a one-way street. So he's backing up. And the next image you see on the security video is his car speeding down, and when it hits the downtown mall, which is flat, it does a little bit of airborne, and it's going, I don't know how fast it was going very fast. It was accelerating into this group of people. And so official reports usually list 19 injured and 1 person killed. There were dozens who were injured and who still are dealing with some of the aftermath.
And many of whom did not want to give their names Correct. To law enforcement or rescue. So dozens of people refused rescue and then were treated. There were activist medics separately, but they didn't want to give their names to law enforcement.
So one of the indelible images for me, because it was so crowded downtown, and though it wasn't far from the hospital, emergency medics could not get there. Street medics did the emergency first aid on all of the people who were injured. And there were some people who needed to get to the hospital before an ambulance would get to them. So I was at the Methodist Church, and I just want to back up for just a minute. When I look out of the porch of the Methodist Church onto the park that morning when I first arrived, there was an armored car, a vehicle, I don't know what you call it, down here on one corner. There were barricades surrounding the park. There were snipers on top of the funeral home and the Historic Society. So I thought it was awful, but I thought, okay, they've got this under control. But none of that was used for anything. But when we got word that this, we didn't know anything about the death, or we just heard somebody rammed a car into a crowd. The young rabbi, the teaching rabbi, a young woman named Rachel, she and her husband, they're wearing their kippah on their heads, and they're like, oh, we can go, our car's at the Water Street garage. And I'm thinking, you do know who's wandering these streets, right? But they took their kippot off and put them in their pockets, and Jeff and Rachel walked across the park to the garage, got their car, and began to ferry people to the hospital.
Yeah.
It was an extraordinary moment for me. And it was then that we began to get people who had been either injured, traumatized, flocking to the church. The Methodist Church was the safe space and the communication hub, and we had some medics on standby there. And when they would come in, they were so terrified that they said, where can we go that there aren't any windows? Because they were so afraid that somebody was going to try to shoot them.
And unknown people trying to get into this church
Correct.
had to have a sponsor from the community to get in. Like, they weren't just letting anyone in off the street.
Yeah.
And around hour and 20 minutes later, people were in the church. I don't know if you were here. We haven't talked about this before. And someone started shouting, like, gun, there's a shooter, there's someone with a gun, like, coming in.
Yep.
And so that church then went on lockdown.
Correct.
Were you inside at that point?
I was inside, and there was somebody walking by and pointed a gun at a crowd in the parking lot. There was also actually almost another car incident, and I had gone to the back parking lot at that point. As people were dispersing, the white supremacists were mostly dispersing, and some guy in his pickup truck realized he couldn't go a certain direction, and so he backed up into almost a crowd of people, missing them. I don't know how he missed them, and then he sped away. And as you look right at that intersection, there was a police car with a woman police officer in it, and I ran over to her. I said, "Did you see that? Aren't you going to go after this guy?" And she said, "I'm told that I have to stay here." And I thought, well, it was such a distressing thing to know that we were basically on our own. Community defense.
Yes.
Yeah. So we could get into a lot more details about that day. I mean, there were 2 more deaths that day. The state police helicopter that crashed, which just added a level of surreal to the day. But my experience throughout the ensuing weeks was there were continual pop-ups of these white supremacists coming to town. On the Jewish festival of Sukkot, Rachel was having a party, a gathering for young adults at the synagogue, which is only a block away from the Methodist Church. And I was on the downtown mall at dinner with my husband and a friend who was visiting, and I started getting messages saying, hey, there's people gathering at the park, can you come? And so I said to Tim and Chris, hey, let's take a walk up towards the synagogue. And several of us gathered there and just surrounded the synagogue. The party was outdoors so that they could have their Sukkot celebration unmolested. And I called the police a couple of times. I said, there's some suspicious vehicles going by. Can you just come? And they never did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was at a Zac Brown band concert in Charlottesville that October, and then torch-wielding white nationalists showed up at UVA again. And I remember going into, I was like in the concerts, like going at like an arena. I remember going in some back door and ending up in some like catering kitchen so I could like make phone calls and like figure out what was going on. For months and months, and for years. I mean, there are still stories of people being followed, and
Yes.
it's become a little bit of a, I don't want to say pilgrimage site, but for white nationalists.
Right.
And Heather's mother, Susan, and I have become very, I'm grateful for her friendship. She has never told, she has told 4 people where Heather's remains are, because she doesn't want to make that burial site a pilgrimage site as well.
Correct. So there was a lot of, several investigations. The state police did a whole investigation. Tim Hafey, who was the prosecutor,
He was the U.S. attorney,
right?
U.S. attorney in the Western District of Virginia until a year or 2 prior.
Right,
and
and
then
he did an analysis.
Yes.
And some of the extraordinary information that came out from that day was that none of the law enforcement agencies had radios that could talk to each other. They weren't on the same channel.
And they were supposed to be.
Right.
And all they had to do was switch a knob, but no one had switched the knobs.
Right. Right.
So.
And so there's a lot that has happened since then to to try to correct some of what happened there. But then, as many people who were in Charlottesville can tell you, a lot of the people who were at the January 6th insurrection were familiar faces to those of us in Charlottesville. So I wonder if you just might kind of draw a thread for us, and then we'll open it up maybe to questions.
I mean, so out of the hundreds of people that were in Charlottesville that day, the only people, other than the driver of the car that crashed into the crowd, the only other people that were arrested that day were 2 women who had their breasts out in protest blocks away. And over the ensuing weeks, there were more arrests that came for people, not for being there, but for doing explicit acts of violence that were caught on camera. And over the years, I mean, we're still finding some of these people. Many of them went back to their communities, went back to their homes and their kids, and went back to their normal lives. And then many of them ended up marching on the Capitol on January 6th. And that's proven. There's a handful of people that have been identified. The morning my book came out, 3 weeks ago, a man was arrested for being part of the insurrection who also was in Charlottesville. So this is very much an ongoing story. The IT, I don't know if director, but an IT man in the city of Charlottesville, who is in charge of the network of the city of Charlottesville, was a January 6th rioter. And when they found out, didn't fire him because they said it was protected activity. So this is very much ongoing and is only going to continue to grow. But I think the enormous lesson from Charlottesville is to listen to your citizens and to listen to people, and that there's no, system that's going to save us, unfortunately.
I think that's a good spot to stop for questions, unless there's something that, we'll probably have an opportunity to add more.
Yeah, we can do a few questions.
Yes, so why don't we do that? Who's our microphone person? There she is. If anybody has questions, just raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone to you.
That was like a lot to end on and then ask for questions.
I know, it is a lot. It is a lot.
What a story. What was the relationship like between the police and the clergy and houses of worship before all of this had happened? On other issues, did you find them to be your partners, or was it tenuous beforehand?
I think that depends on who you ask, because for those of us on the white side of white privilege, we can have, I had good relationships with the police, with the mayor, with the city, until all of this happened. I had no reason to doubt them, whereas many of the people who I encountered over that summer who had either lived in Charlottesville or who were people of color or gender minorities or whatever it happened to be, they had a different story to tell. So in my trying to be a pastor to the community, I learned a lot about the inequality and how the police interaction with the community was. I would say there still to this day is a lot of tension between those of us who are really pretty honest about how the law enforcement response was over that whole summer, and those who some of those who had been activists even beforehand. There are plenty of people who they wanted the police chief was invited to a clergy collective meeting a couple of weeks before this event. I mean, we were trying to encourage the police to do that, who assured us that they were ready and prepared for all of that. It was very disappointing, quite frankly. I mean, for me, it was a lesson. I have said to many people that was, I learned more that summer than I've learned in most of my ministry. And I learned it from community members and activists who had experiences so different from my own.
Nora, I read the beginning of the pre-release of the book, and in it there was a quote by a rabbi who was talking about feeling very distressed and anxious for his congregation. And Elaine, you just mentioned that one of the synagogues was very close to campus.
It's just one, there's only one synagogue. So
Okay.
that's Tom Goodertz, who's the senior rabbi, and Rachel was the teaching rabbi.
So the thing that surprised me was, you know, when I look back on my memories of that day, it's more like, I guess I have in my mind like KKK robes or, you know, anti-African American, but you know, it's obvious they were neo-Nazis, so they also were anti-Semitic. But
And it could be the conflation of two events. So on July 8th, a small, whatever, community of Klan people from North Carolina also had a permit to rally. And so there was a Klan rally on July 8th, at which we recognized we were not anywhere close to being prepared for what we knew was coming on August 12th. And the Klan rally was closer, actually, to the synagogue than the Unite the Right rally was. That rally, the Klan was escorted in and out of town, and they were on their way out of town, and everything was settling down, and supposedly nobody can document, nobody heard a dispersal order being given, and when the activists continued to kind of mill about in the streets trying to figure out what to do next, tear gas canisters were thrown, not at the Klan, but at the ones who were there protesting them. That was not a good preparation for what was coming on August 12th. At that point, I would say that the sense of any confidence in being protected, there wasn't any more from the community members.
I think that anti-Semitism is an interesting point and an important one because there's an enormous anti-Semitism, but there's also, and also, fascism in its kind of largest way of thinking is anti-anything that is not cisgender or heterosexual, white, Christian, Judeo-Christian men. And so there was an enormous amount of transphobia. There was an enormous amount of anti-queer rhetoric. One of the things, the line of pastors that you may have seen photos of that was beat up by the white nationalists, the thing that they were yelling at them when they were over them on the ground was about being gay, which not all of them were. In more colorful language than that. The anti-Semitism was rampant. And then, of course, a hatred of people of color as well. But it was anyone who was not them.
I think the terrifying thing for the synagogue community was at the Torch March when they were chanting blood and soil and Jews will not replace us, which is so clearly language from the Third Reich. I mean, they are, and that the Jewish community still showed up. Another image I have is of Rabbi Tom, who they just made their Shabbat services a little earlier that Saturday morning, and he's a block away from the Methodist Church, and he showed up with his prayer shawl trailing behind him, and he rubbed his hands together. He said, "Okay, what do you need me to do?" And I thought, you could just go home where it's safe, you know. But they wanted to be a part of it because they wanted to make sure that the anti-Semitism did not stand, that it did not stand unopposed.
There's a moment in the book that's horrible, but like almost funny in how horrible it is, which is that when the car attack happens, when there's this threat on the synagogue, a police officer in the crowd, in the command center, so in the main command center, the mayor is there who is Jewish and his wife, and this police officer, they said, where was the crash? And someone said, oh, it was down the street from the synagogue. And one of the Charlottesville city police officers, the town is 7 square miles wide, said, synagogue, is there a synagogue in Charlottesville? Where's the synagogue? How can you protect something if you don't know it's there? And this was in the control center.
I remember after January 6th, the New York Times analyzed the attendees and said there was a high degree of bankruptcies or economic dislocation in the attendees. Do you think that's a driving or force behind this movement in general? Is it because of the hollowing out of America? That people feel they're left behind and looking for a scapegoat that unites them?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think the white nationalist argument that has kind of grown up is something called the Great Replacement theory. And the idea of the Great Replacement is that America is becoming browner and queerer and more immigrant, and they're losing America. And it especially preys on the demographic that supports President Trump, people who do feel like they have been left behind, people who do feel like they have something that they want to fight for, and predominantly does fall into this Great Replacement theory. And so the fact that a lot of them are maybe have had financial troubles in the past is certainly part of it. Part of it also is the communities that they're from. But also that's not the case overall. Very many of them are also highly educated, wealthy individuals from urban areas, like New York City, shockingly urban areas, and who also have this hate that they are propagating and promoting kind of to their own ends. And so I think it's certainly a part of it, but in Charlottesville, there were people from 39 states, people from all over, white nationalists from 39 states. This is not isolated to any one group, really. Maybe we'll do one more and then finish up, just because we have time.
Hi. Getting back to the police, can you just clarify, to what degree do they have any investigation of where all of this breakdown happened? Because it seems like the police got a slap on the wrist or a free pass, whereas in other situations like that, wouldn't some heads have rolled or any consequences? Because it seems like it was a dereliction of basic responsibilities on the part of the government and the police.
What I do want to point out, the chief of police, he resigned, was under pressure in December. The events happened in August. He resigned, and the city manager the following summer, the city manager is the one, it has more power than the mayor in the way the system is set up. Interestingly, though, and people will point this out to you, these are the only two African-American, that both of them were African-American, and they were the ones who had to leave. I think Charlottesville has had 6 police chiefs.
I think we're on 7 now.
Okay, since then.
Since then, yeah.
Yeah, the city government descended somewhat into chaos. I was talking with one of the professors at UVA earlier this week. I went to the city council meetings that ensued after all of this happened, and for some reason, the city council thought that they'd just be able to do their business meetings and everything was going to be fine. The community members wanted none of it. They wanted their pain and their rage and their hurt to be heard, and so every city council meeting, no business got done because the city did not take seriously, even in the aftermath, that you can't just go back to business as normal. There's too much harm that's been done.
Yeah. Okay.
I
think just given timing, I think we'll stop there, but we'll be here after.
Yeah.
But we'll let Martin come up.
Perhaps afterwards you might want to stay and then you could ask some more questions. I'm sure we could go on here a long time on such an important topic. And we're really grateful to you both, Nora especially for, creating this record.
Yeah.
And to Elaine, we've heard eyewitness accounts really today, and that is very significant. And we're grateful to you both for your time and for your courage and eloquence, and grateful you've been willing to come here today and share all that with us. And thank you to all of you for coming to share in this. It's been really good to have you along here today. And please do stay and chat at the end. Please do come back and join us for other things in the future. We'd be really glad to have you here. And go and buy the book afterwards as well. Get online or get to your bookshop. So let's express our thanks once again to Nora and Elaine.